The autumn wind carried a chill that seemed to settle in Margaret's bones as she stood at the edge of the park, watching children chase each other through piles of crimson leaves. At 60, she had grown accustomed to the ache of the weather, of time, of a life that hadn't unfolded the way she'd once dreamed. Her silver hair caught the fading sunlight, and her hands, still steady despite their wrinkles, clutched a worn leather journal. It was her confidant, her witness, filled with words she'd never spoken aloud. Today, though, her thoughts weren't on the pages, but on the letter she'd received that morning, its words searing into her like a fresh wound. 40 years ago, Margaret had been a young mother, radiant with hope, married to Edward, a man whose charm could light up a room. They'd built a life together in a modest Chicago home, raising two children, Clara and Thomas, with dreams of family vacations and college funds. Edward was ambitious, a rising star in finance, and Margaret had been content to manage their home, pouring her heart into their children's laughter and bedtime stories. But ambition has a way of shifting priorities, and Edward's late nights at the office grew longer, his smiles rarer. By the time Clara was 10 and Thomas 8, Edward had left, walking out for a new life with a younger woman, Diane, and the promise of a shinier future. The divorce had been a quiet devastation. Margaret didn't scream or beg. She simply signed the papers, packed his belongings, and watched him drive away. He'd promised to stay involved, to be a father still, but his visits dwindled. His calls faded, and soon, the children's questions about Daddy became too heavy for Margaret to answer. She took a job as a librarian, then another as a part-time tutor, piecing together a life for Clara and Thomas. She never spoke ill of Edward, even when they asked why he'd stopped coming. "He's busy," she'd say, her voice steady, though her heart cracked each time. Now, decades later, the letter in her pocket changed everything. It was from St. Augustine's Academy, the elite private school where Edward's new children, twins, a boy and a girl, born to him and Diane, were enrolled. The letter thanked an anonymous donor for covering the twins' tuition for the past 5 years. Margaret's hands trembled as she read it, not out of shock, but from the weight of a secret she'd carried alone. She was that donor. Every year, she'd funneled money from her modest savings, earned through late-night tutoring and careful budgeting, to ensure Edward's new children had the education he'd once promised their own. Why had she done it? Even Margaret struggled to explain it to herself. It wasn't love for Edward, long since buried that. It wasn't pity for Diane, who'd built a life on the ruins of Margaret's. It was for the twins, two children she'd never met, who carried no blame for their father's choices. She'd seen their names on a school newsletter Edward had carelessly forwarded years ago, a rare slip in his otherwise meticulous erasure of his old life. Something in her had stirred a need to give them what she'd fought to give Clara and Thomas. Despite Edward's absence, Margaret walked slowly to a bench, the journal heavy in her hands. She opened it, her pen hovering over a blank page. The words wouldn't come. Not yet. Instead, memories flooded in: Clara's graduation, where she'd beamed with pride despite the empty seat beside Margaret. Thomas's first job, when he'd hugged her and whispered, "You did this, Mom." They'd thrived, her children, but the scars of their father's abandonment lingered. Clara's guarded heart, Thomas's quiet anger, they were marks Edward had left, marks Margaret couldn't erase. The letter wasn't the only thing that had arrived. Edward had called yesterday, his voice smooth as ever, asking to meet. He'd heard rumors, he said, about the twins' tuition, about a donor who sounded suspiciously like her. He wanted answers. Margaret hadn't agreed to the meeting. Not yet. But the thought of facing him after all these years churned her stomach. What would she say? that she'd paid for his new family's dreams because she believed in second chances, even for those who didn't deserve them, that she'd done it to prove she was stronger than his betrayal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret closed her journal. She didn't need to write today. The story was still unfolding. And tomorrow, she'd decide whether to face Edward or let her secret remain hers alone. For now, she stood, brushing leaves from her coat, and walked home, her steps steady despite the weight of the past. Edward's call had left Margaret sleepless, her mind tangled in memories and questions. She sat at her kitchen table, a single lamp casting shadows across the room. The clock ticked past midnight, each second a reminder of the meeting she'd reluctantly agreed to. Edward had insisted on a coffee shop downtown. Neutral ground, he'd called it. Margaret hadn't seen him in 20 years. Not since a fleeting encounter at Clara's college graduation, where he'd lingered at the edge of the crowd, a stranger to his own daughter's triumph. Now, at 62, he was a ghost from a life she'd rebuilt without him. The coffee shop was bustling when Margaret arrived, its warmth a stark contrast to the crisp October air. She chose a corner table, her journal tucked into her bag like a shield. Edward entered minutes later, his hair now gray, his suit still impeccable. He carried the same confidence that had once drawn her in. But there was something new in his eyes' uncertainty. Perhaps, or the weight of time. He spotted her and approached, his smile practiced but strained. "Margaret," he said, sitting across from her. "You look, well." She nodded, her voice calm but firm. "What do you want?" "Edward." He leaned forward, his fingers tapping the table. "I heard about the tuition. Street. Augustine's. They say there's an anonymous donor. But I know it's you. Why would you do that?" Margaret's heart thudded, but she kept her gaze steady. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind. But the reality of his question stung. "Does it matter why?" she asked. "It's done." "It matters to me," he said, his voice softening. But there was an edge to it, a mix of curiosity and defensiveness. "You owe me nothing, Margaret. Not after everything." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken history. Margaret sipped her coffee, buying time. She could tell him the truth that she'd paid for his twins' education because she couldn't bear the thought of any child being denied opportunities. Not when she had the means to help. But admitting it felt like giving him power over her again. And she wasn't sure she was ready for that. Instead, she said, "Clara and Thomas turned out fine without you. I made sure of that. Maybe I just wanted to make sure your other kids had a chance too." Edward flinched. And for a moment, she saw the man she'd once loved. Not the one who'd walked away. "I wasn't a good father to them," he admitted, his voice low. "I know that. But the twins, they're my second chance. Diane and I, we've built something good." Margaret's chest tightened. She wanted to ask if he'd ever thought of Clara and Thomas, if he'd ever regretted leaving them behind. But she didn't. Instead, she pulled her journal from her bag and opened it to a page she'd written years ago, when Thomas had asked why his father didn't love him. She didn't show it to Edward, but the words grounded her. "You are enough," even when he wasn't. "Margaret," Edward continued, "if you're funding their school, I need to know why. And I need to know how. You were a librarian. For God's sake. Where did the money come from?" She almost laughed. He still saw her as the woman he'd left, scraping by, defined by her sacrifices. He didn't know about the tutoring business she'd built, the late nights teaching calculus to wealthy high schoolers, the investments she'd made with her modest earnings. She'd become resourceful, resilient, a woman who'd turned pain into purpose. "I managed," She said simply. I always have. Edward's eyes narrowed. Searching her face for answers she wasn't ready to give. The conversation shifted to small talk Clara's career as a pediatrician. Thomas's work as an engineer, but Margaret felt the weight of his unspoken questions. As they parted ways, he promised to call again, to figure this out. Margaret nodded, but in her heart, she knew she held the cards. She'd given his children a gift he couldn't claim, and that power was hers alone. Back home, she opened her journal again, her pen moving swiftly. She wrote about the meeting, about the flicker of guilt in Edward's eyes, and about the strength she'd found in keeping her secret. Tomorrow, she'd visit Clara, share a glass of wine, and maybe, just maybe, tell her the truth about the tuition. For now, though, she was content to let the secret simmer, a quiet act of defiance against a man who'd underestimated her. Margaret's apartment was a sanctuary of soft light and familiar comforts, a bookshelf lined with novels, a worn quilt draped over the couch, photos of Clara and Thomas smiling at every milestone. But tonight, as she sat with a cup of chamomile tea, the space felt smaller, the air heavier. Edward's voice lingered in her mind, his questions prodding at wounds she'd thought long healed. She hadn't told him the full truth, not about the money, not about the years of sacrifice, and certainly not about the quiet pride she took in her secret. The next morning, Clara arrived, her doctor's scrubs swapped for a cozy sweater. At 38, she was a mirror of Margaret's younger self, sharp eyes, a warm smile, but with a guardedness that hadn't been there before Edward left. They settled on the couch, a bottle of Merlot between them, and Margaret felt the weight of the conversation she'd been avoiding. Mom, you look tired, Clara said, her voice gentle but probing. What's going on? Margaret hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. She'd always been honest with her children, but this truth felt different, tangled in emotions she hadn't fully unraveled. I saw your father, she said finally. He wanted to talk about some things. Clara's face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. What does he want now? He doesn't get to just waltz back in. It's not about us, Margaret said, though the words felt heavy. It's about his other kids. The twins. Clara's eyes widened, a mix of confusion and anger. What do they have to do with anything? Margaret took a deep breath and told her everything: the anonymous donations, the years of quietly paying for the twins' tuition, the letter from Street Augustine's. She spoke of the sleepless nights when she'd questioned her own motives, wondering if she was trying to prove something to Edward, to herself, or to the world. As she spoke, Clara's expression softened, her anger giving way to something deeper: admiration. Perhaps. Or all. Mom, Clara said, her voice breaking. Why didn't you tell us? You've been carrying this alone. Margaret shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. I didn't want you or Thomas to think I was, I don't know, betraying you. I just wanted to do something good, something he couldn't take credit for. Clara reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. You're incredible. You know that. But you don't have to carry everything alone. Not anymore. The words unlocked something in Margaret, a release she hadn't known she needed. They talked late into the night, Clara asking questions about the twins, about how Margaret had managed the payments, about what it felt like to keep such a secret. For the first time, Margaret felt the burden lighten, shared with someone who understood the depth of her love and her pain. The next day, Margaret visited the library where she'd worked for decades. It was a place of solace, its shelves holding stories of triumph and loss, much like her own. She wandered to the children's section, where she used to read to Clara and Thomas, and found herself thinking of Edward's twins. She'd never met them, but she imagined them here, their eyes wide with wonder as they turned the pages of a book. The thought brought a pang of longing not for Edward, but for the connection she'd forged through her silent generosity. That evening, she received another call from Edward. His tone was different this time, less guarded, more urgent. "Margaret, I need to see you again. Diane found out about the tuition. She's upset. She thinks I knew." Margaret's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "What did you tell her?" "That I had no idea," he said, frustration creeping in. "But she doesn't believe me. She thinks we're in debt to you, that you're holding this over us." Margaret almost laughed at the irony. Holding it over them. She'd never wanted recognition, never wanted to be a shadow over their lives. "Tell her the truth," she said. "Tell her it was a gift. No strings attached." There was a long pause. "You're not the woman I left," Edward said finally, his voice soft. "You're more." Margaret ended the call without responding. She didn't need his validation. Not anymore. As she opened her journal, she wrote about Clara's reaction, about the library, about the strange peace she felt knowing her secret was no longer entirely her own. The story wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The days following Clara's visit were a blur of reflection and quiet resolve. Margaret found herself returning to the park, the same one where she'd stood when the letter arrived. The leaves were thinner now, the trees barer, but the air felt lighter, as if sharing her secret with Clara had lifted a weight from her shoulders. She hadn't heard from Edward since their last call, but Diane's reaction lingered in her mind. The idea that her generosity could be seen as a debt, a manipulation, stung more than she'd expected. Margaret's tutoring sessions kept her busy, her evenings filled with teenagers grappling with algebra and calculus. She was good at it, patient, encouraging, able to make even the most complex problems feel solvable. It was this work that had funded the twins' tuition, her quiet evenings translating into opportunities for children she'd never met. But now, with Edward and Diane aware of her role, the act felt less like a gift and more like a spotlight she hadn't asked for. A week later, Thomas called, his voice steady but laced with concern. Clara had told him everything, and he wanted to see her. Margaret invited him over, bracing herself for his reaction. Thomas, now 36, was quieter than his sister, his anger at Edward buried deeper. When he arrived, his broad shoulders filled the doorway, and his hug was fierce, protective. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" he asked, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. "You've been paying for his kid's school. After everything he did." Margaret sighed, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "It wasn't about him, Thomas. It was about them. They're just kids." Thomas shook his head, his jaw tight. "You're too good, Mom. He doesn't deserve this. Neither does Diane." "I didn't do it for them," Margaret said softly. "I did it because I could. Because I know what it's like to fight for your kid's future." Thomas's eyes softened, but the anger didn't fully fade. They talked for hours, Margaret sharing more about her reasons, about the nights she'd questioned herself, about the pride she felt in Clara and Thomas's successes. By the time he left, he'd promised to support whatever she decided next, though she could see he was still wrestling with the idea of her sacrifice. The next morning, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Diane stood at her door, her face a mix of defiance and unease. She was younger than Margaret, her hair still dark, her posture polished but tense. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice clipped. Margaret nodded, Stepping aside, they sat in the living room, the silence heavy between them. Diane spoke first, her words careful but sharp. Edward told me about the tuition. I don't understand why you did it, and I don't like feeling indebted to you. Margaret's heart sank, but she kept her voice even. It was never about debt. It was a gift. For your children. Diane's eyes narrowed. Why? You don't know them. You don't know us. Margaret considered her words carefully. I know what it's like to want the best for your kids. I didn't do it to hurt you or Edward. I did it because I could. Diane's expression softened, just slightly, but the tension remained. We can pay you back, she said. We don't need your charity. It's not charity, Margaret said, her voice firm. And I don't want repayment. I just want you to know they're taken care of. The conversation ended awkwardly, Diane leaving with a promise to discuss it with Edward. Margaret felt drained but oddly relieved. She'd faced Diane, spoken her truth, and held her ground. That night, she wrote in her journal, her words flowing with a clarity she hadn't felt before. She wrote about Thomas's protectiveness, Diane's defensiveness, and her own quiet strength. She wasn't the woman Edward had left, nor was she the one Diane had expected. She was Margaret, resilient, generous, and unapologetic. As she closed her journal, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Clara, dinner tomorrow. Thomas and I want to take you out. Margaret smiled, her heart warming. Whatever happened with Edward and Diane, she had her children, her story, and a legacy of kindness no one could take away. Dinner with Clara and Thomas was a balm to Margaret's soul. They'd chosen a small Italian restaurant, its warm lighting and soft music creating a cocoon of comfort. Clara laughed as she recounted a patient's antics, while Thomas teased her about her terrible taste in wine. Margaret watched them, her heart swelling with pride. They'd grown into people she admired, kind, driven, resilient despite the shadows of their past. The conversation turned to Edward, and for the first time, Margaret felt ready to share her plans. I'm going to stop the payments, she said, her voice steady. The twins are in their final year. They'll be fine, and I've done enough. Clara reached for her hand, her eyes shining. You've done more than enough, Mom. You always have. Thomas nodded, his expression softer than it had been in days. I'm proud of you, but I still want to give Dad a piece of my mind. Margaret smiled, a mix of amusement and gratitude. Let's leave that to the past. Thomas, I don't need to fight him anymore. The decision felt right, like closing a chapter she'd been writing for too long. But the next day brought a new challenge. Edward called again, his voice urgent, almost pleading. Margaret, Diane and I talked. We want to meet the twins' benefactor. They deserve to know who's been helping them. Margaret's heart raced. She'd never intended to meet the twins, never wanted her gift to be anything but anonymous. The thought of facing them, of seeing Edward's eyes in their faces, was both terrifying and strangely compelling. I'll think about it, she said, her voice calm despite the storm inside her. Over the next few days, Margaret wrestled with the idea. She walked through the park, her journal in hand, writing fragments of thoughts. What would it mean to meet them? To let them see me? She thought of Clara and Thomas, of how they'd carried their father's absence, and wondered if the twins carried a similar weight, unaware of the woman who'd quietly shaped their futures. Finally, she agreed to a meeting, but on her terms, a quiet cafe. Just her and the twins. No Edward. No Diane. When the day arrived, Margaret arrived early, her hands trembling as she sipped her tea. The twins, Lily and James, entered together, both 17, with Edward's dark eyes but a warmth that was entirely their own. They were polite, curious, and a little nervous. "You're the one who paid for our school?" Lily asked, her voice soft but direct. Margaret nodded, her throat tight. "I wanted you to have opportunities. That's all." James leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Why? You don't even know us." Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening. "I know what it's like to want the best for someone you love. I did it because I could, and because I believe in you." The twins exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of gratitude and confusion. They asked about her life, her work, her children, and Margaret answered honestly, sharing stories of Clara and Thomas, of the library, of the life she'd built. She didn't mention Edward, and neither did they, as if an unspoken agreement hung between them. As they parted, Lily hugged her, a quick, unexpected embrace that left Margaret breathless. "Thank you," Lily whispered. "You didn't have to do this." Margaret returned home, her heart full and heavy. She opened her journal, writing about the twins' faces, their voices, the way they'd looked at her with something like awe. She'd given them more than money, she'd given them a piece of her heart. And in return, they'd given her closure she hadn't known she needed. That night, she dreamed of the park, of leaves falling like memories, and woke with a sense of peace. The story wasn't over, but she was ready for its next chapter, whatever it might bring. The weeks after meeting the twins were a quiet revelation for Margaret. She felt lighter, as if the secret she'd carried for years had finally found its place in the world. She continued her tutoring, her evenings filled with equations and eager students. But there was a new ease in her steps, a clarity in her thoughts. The twins had sent her a thank you note, handwritten and heartfelt, and she'd tucked it into her journal, a reminder that her kindness had rippled beyond her own pain. Edward called one last time, his voice softer, almost humbled. "The twins told me about your meeting," he said. "They're amazed by you. So am I." Margaret listened, her heart steady. "I didn't do it for you, Edward. I did it for them." "I know," he said, and for the first time, she heard genuine regret in his voice. "I wasn't there for Clara and Thomas. I failed them. But you've been more than I ever was." The words should have meant more, but Margaret found they didn't. She'd spent years proving she didn't need Edward's approval. And now, his acknowledgement felt like an afterthought. "Take care of your family," she said simply, and ended the call. Clara and Thomas noticed the change in her. At their next dinner, they teased her about her newfound glow, and Margaret laughed, sharing stories of the twins, of their curiosity and kindness. She told them about her decision to stop the payments, to let Edward and Diane take responsibility for their children's futures. Clara raised a glass, her eyes shining. "To you, Mom. To everything you are." As winter settled over Chicago, Margaret found herself returning to the park less often. Her journal less a refuge and more a record of a life well lived. She wrote about the twins, about Clara and Thomas, about the woman she'd become, not defined by Edward's betrayal, but by her own choices, her own strength. She wrote about forgiveness not for Edward, but for herself, for the years she'd carried guilt for his absence. One snowy afternoon, Margaret received an invitation to the twins' graduation from St. Augustine's. It was addressed to her by name, not as an anonymous donor, and included a note from Lily and James, asking her to attend as their guest. Margaret hesitated, then accepted, knowing it would be her final act in this chapter of her story. The ceremony was a blur of proud parents and beaming graduates, and Margaret sat quietly in the audience, her heart full as she watched Lily and James cross the stage. They spotted her afterward, rushing over to hug her, their faces alight with gratitude. Edward and Diane were there too, standing at a distance, and Margaret met their eyes briefly, offering a nod that held no resentment, only closure. Back home, Margaret opened her journal one last time for this story. She wrote about the graduation, about the twins' smiles, about the peace she'd found in letting go. She wrote about Clara and Thomas, her anchors, and about the unexpected connection she'd forged with Lily and James. Her pen paused, then moved again. A final sentence: I gave them a chance. Not because of him, but because of me. She closed the journal, placing it on the shelf beside photos of her children. Her life. The snow fell outside, blanketing the city in quiet, and Margaret felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the season. She'd built a legacy not of wealth or fame, but of kindness, resilience, and love. And that, she knew, was enough.